Okay, good morning, everyone. We're excited to have Dr. Javier with us this morning, and I'm sure Dr. Pena, and I'm sure we're going to have a good time. So today we're talking about monitoring workloads in team sports. So we asked the question, are we really on track? I'm pretty sure we're going to have a fuller house. People trickling in slowly, and we already have a good number of people online. So we're pretty much going to have a good time. So Dr. Pena is the Director of Sports and Physical Activity Studies at the University of Vic Central and University of Catalonia. Did I get it?
Yeah.
In Spain. So he's a professor, and he professes sports sciences and a member of Sports Performance Analysis Research Group in the same institution. He's also the head and the assistant for strength and conditioning for several teams. I'm not going to mention them, there are quite a number of them here. He's worked with high-level elite teams. Currently developing a research project about athletes' readiness and fatigue at the University of Alberta, Canada. We're excited to have him today to talk about training workloads, and I'm hoping that we're going to have enough time to go through what he has to talk about. And he pretty much going to talk about this for about 45 minutes, and we're going to have about 15 minutes of questions. And if you have any extra or further questions, he's going to be around for another 30 minutes after this presentation for free meetings, and you can just consult with him right here in front. So without further ado, I'm just going to hand over the microphone to Dr. Pena. Thank you for coming around.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so first of all, as we do normally in these situations, I would like to thank Dr. Emery and Dr. Owoye for the invitation and for everybody to attend the talk. I will do a presentation of my research center at the end, because I think you're here because you want to know more about workloads, not about me, but it would be interesting if we can have a lot of connections. So one of the main purposes when you go abroad as a researcher, obviously, is to get as many connections as possible to keep doing your work as best as possible. And in the end, we need a lot of international connections right now to develop really good research. Introducing the talk, we're going to talk about monitoring workloads in team sports. I would say that right now it's trending topic in the world of training and in the world of even injury prevention. But most of the time, we are not sure about if we are conducting the processes in the right way. That's the reason why we have entitled the topic, Are We Really on Track? And you have here different tracks that you can choose, because in the end, we have a lot of options, a wide array of options when it comes to monitor loads. And we're going to try to speak more about that. The first part of the talk is going to be like an introduction, some reflections on the matter, and in the end I'm going to explain the project that we've been conducting in the University of Alberta since mid-January, because I think, in my humble opinion, is a good example of something you can do in one particular sport, that in our case was volleyball and women's volleyball, and it can be as an example of something that can be good practices when it comes to injury prevention, although I'm going to tell you that I had a lot of questions before starting the project, and I even have more questions after ending it. So that's the reason why probably it is so nice to conduct research, because if you're a curious person, you will have a lot of questions before and after doing all the processes. So more or less the contents that we are going to deal with are the ones that you can find in here. So we're going to talk about the state of the art in monitoring workloads in team sports. So let's go into see more or less what are the possibilities and what is the situation when it comes to international consensus and probably the research that has been conducted in the past regarding this aspect of monitoring workloads. I'm going to try to set or to give my thoughts about the limitations that we face on the matter, and especially when it comes to team sports, because in the end it's not the same to monitor loads in individual sports than in team sports. We have some constraints and particularities that we have to face when deciding to conduct these processes of monitoring workloads. Of course, I'm going to talk about opportunities and future perspectives, and again, I'm going to give you more insight about my project at the University of Alberta, because in the end, my idea when I came to Canada was to face it as an opportunity to conduct more research and to try to go more in depth into the topic. and then in the end some take-home messages and some time hopefully for the discussion. I will try to adjust to the 60 minutes. I cannot guarantee that because I'm really enthusiastic about the topic. I will do my best, but sorry if we cannot adjust 100% to the assigned time. So when it comes to monitoring workloads, we think about it as something that is pretty new, but in the end, historically, there has been always great interest in quantifying training loads. And as you can see here, this is one of the first Douglas bags. So we can go to 1916 when it was invented and used probably for the first time, or at least we have the first pictures of its use in running. So it's not such a new topic as we think it is. But in the end, we have to acknowledge, and that is something that is pretty clear right now, that it wasn't until the improvement in technology that came around the 1980s that the scientific community is providing better markers and when the concept of internal load arose or emerged. In here you have two examples of technology that was developed by the moment. The first polar heart rate wireless band in 1981, if I'm not wrong, and one of the first COSME equipments to monitor oxygen consumption. In this case it was the K2 that was used in modern pentathlon, that it came in 1982. So since then, probably the topic has evolved dramatically, and with the emergence of a lot of wearable technology lately, we can have right now more data than at any other point in the development of scientific research talking about monitoring workloads. Obviously, right now we consider it an essential process. It is really difficult to find high-level teams, but even intermediate-level teams that are not monitoring their loads. Essentially, when we conduct these processes, when we do this monitoring, we are trying in some ways to fulfill these four objectives that we have in here. We try to determine if the athletes are adapting correctly to their training program or not, especially to improve decision-making on the athlete readiness and to adjust what the athlete is facing on a day-to-day basis when it comes to training. Obviously, one of the things that is right now really important is the ability of minimizing the risk of overtraining and injury by conducting all these processes and by getting all this data. We try as well to monitor recovery and the effects of training and competition schedules, because we know in some particular team athletes, the schedules can be really hard with them. We can think about NBA athletes, for example, competing almost every 2 days. So we need to monitor what's going on in their bodies and minds to help them to be ready for the next competitions. And of course, to provide data to inform day-to-day coaching decisions, because in the end, in my opinion, and I consider myself an applied researcher, if we cannot give information to the coaches to make some changes to their day-to-day decisions, it's because these processes are being pointless. And I guess when we invest a lot of efforts on that, it's because we want to make the most of the information that we are providing coaches, practitioners, and athletes. In the end, the difficulties that come from monitoring workloads is because we need that some fatigue is necessary to create physical adaptations and mental adaptations. That is pretty obvious. So by sitting on our couch, we are not going to get better the next day playing or competing. But the thing is that we are not 100% sure about how this fatigue is going to affect the readiness and the chronic fatigue of the athletes. So a lot of things are still unknown when it comes to adapt the loads, because we know that applying the same load to two different individuals is going to have different consequences and different effects. So the thing is that fatigue is a really complex concept, and monitoring workloads can help us in some ways to find more subjective indicators to provide a critical insight to try to minimize the risk of non-functional overreaching, injury, and illness. So again, we know that if we apply the adequate load over the athlete on the athlete, we're going to provoke a functional overreaching. With sufficient recovery, we're going to have a performance enhancement. But if we apply an excessive load, what we're going to provoke is a non-functional overreaching. And additionally, if there is insufficient recovery, we will find a performance decrement, and in worst case scenario, we're going to find overtraining syndromes. And we want, of course, to avoid this situation. But the point is, although we have really good theories supporting how to impose those loads on the athletes, we are not 100% all the time that we are doing the right things. So monitoring is going to help us to try to find more evidence that we are applying the adequate load. That is the point why probably right now we are investing so much effort on trying to find the right monitoring processes. Using again the words from Shona Halson, one of the best recovery experts in the world from the AIS, when we are using monitoring training loads, initially the two main objectives are to provide a scientific explanation for changes in performance. And probably when we are looking for scientific explanations is because we're coming to the academic field. And here is where the people from the academia can help the coaches, because in the end we are the ones that know more about research. And because it can enhance the clarity and confidence for these changes, minimizing the degree of uncertainty that is associated. And this thing is really important. Because all the time when we conduct these monitoring processes and there are coaches around, they're going to be coming all the time to ask, because they are 100% sure that they are doing the right things, but in the end they have the feeling that they do not know everything about how they are imposing the loads on their athletes. So it is really curious how even when we are talking about expert coaches, when we start to conduct monitoring processes around them, many of them can feel insecurity, and they come on a daily basis just to find if this athlete jumped this or that, or the other one was so tired because we got some RP in the morning. And that's because although we are expert coaches, there's always a degree of uncertainty that is associated with the fact of training, and by the fact that in some cases there's still some unknown things about the topic. One of the really big problems that we have in this field of monitoring loads is that despite the efforts of the scientific community, there is still no single marker that can quantify the fitness and fatigue responses to training. So even with really good research conducted in the past, and I would say interesting efforts by the scientific community, we are still on the search of one definitive marker. And my opinion is that probably there is no single definitive marker that can define the load. So we have to try to find, or to try to implement more research to try to find which of these markers are the most interesting for us. And in some cases, some of them are going to be dependent on the discipline, depending on the athletes, on their background. So many things are going to be important before making the decision of which marker is going to be more useful for me in one particular situation. And of course, this knowledge is for sure something really relevant when it comes to start all these processes around teams and athletes. As a consequence, and the fact that there is no single marker that we can identify as the most relevant one, in the recent past, significant resources have been invested in a field that is still in its infancy. And as you can see here, if we go from the year 2000, and these are results coming from PubMed with the terms training load and injuries, we can find that from approximately 2000, the number of publications using these terms has increased significantly, but we consider that the field is still in its infancy, because if we compare, for example, to the number of publications with the terms resistant training, we can see there is a really big difference. So although we consider that the topic is right now trendy, we still need to invest more resources and to try to find new information about these publications, because we do not have enough of them when we compare to traditional topics in the field of strength and conditioning, like resistance training. And probably the fact that monitoring is something that has been in some ways linked to professional athletes makes it not so relevant. If we compare it to things like resistance training that is going to affect a general population, and that's the reason why probably we can get more funds and we can get more resources to try to impulse this type of research. Although we need to invest more resources and to try to implement more research, in the recent past, as we've seen, the number of publications has risen, but not all the methods tested in the past that have some degree of evidence behind, and this table comes from one of the international consensus that was published in 2017. Not all these methods that have been tested are going to be suitable in team sports because of one of the things that we've been mentioning before, the specific nature of these disciplines. So in here we're going to find a bunch of internal measures that have been tested in the past, a bunch of external measures that also have been tested in the past. Here you have a lot of recommendations, the cost, the hardware needed, the software needed, the ease of use, if it's valid, reliable, the method, if it's used to interpret, to prescribe, and the variables that are going to come from all of them. But in the end, not all of them, again, are going to be useful when it comes to team sports. Additionally, apart from the processes that have been conducted in the past when it comes to formal research, we know right now that there's a proliferation of new sensors and wearable solutions. And when all these wearable solutions, a lot of claims of the companies that are manufacturing these wearable solutions are going to try to convince us that it is really beneficial for us to use these wearables. And in most cases, you can find some of them that do not even have a scientific validation behind. And that is one of the problems when we want to use them, because they can be really convenient, but at the same time, we have to be 100% sure that the equipment that we are using is going to be reliable. And it happened to me when I wanted to come to Canada to implement this project that I'm going to speak about afterwards, that I was looking for specific equipment, and we needed to be 100% sure that the one that we were using was validated by research. Because if not, you are in the risk of using data that is going to provide some information to the coaches that they cannot believe. And that is something that can be really problematic. So most of the companies, especially the biggest ones, are of course conducting a lot of non-independent research. But in my opinion, at least we have independent research saying that the equipment and the tools are valid. We cannot use them in proper research, because we are obviously at risk of not giving, again, the right information to the coaches and the athletes and the practitioners. And that is something that for sure we do not want inside a team environment. Although all these companies and manufacturers are doing a really big effort, and even with the solutions that have been validated, we have a lot of them, and the problem is that at some point we are at risk of creating a potential overload to make informed decisions. Because even being an expert, sometimes you have a lot of difficulties trying to decide which equipment to use. So again, we have to be 100% sure that we are using the right equipment and we are using it in the right way, and we are providing the best information to the coaches and the athletes. For this reason, and going a little bit back to my talk, before selecting metrics or technology to monitor these workloads in team sports, we need to check the validity of these equipment and metrics. So we have to be 100% sure that the measurement is well-founded and corresponds accurately to the real world. And of course, when it comes to validity, we have to be sure about the sensitivity and the specificity. So sensitivity, if the equipment or the metric is able to detect small but important changes in performance, and we know a lot in sport about small worthwhile changes, because in the end, a change for us is not the change that is required to medicine when they are, for example, testing new drugs. We know that 100% improvement in one of our athletes is going to make the difference in some cases of winning a medal or not winning a medal. So these small changes and the ability to detect these small changes is something really relevant. Of course, the specificity, discriminating between positive and negative values, and this is something super relevant when it comes to injury prevention. But at the same time, we need our equipment to be reliable, so meaning providing a similar result from day to day. And in my humble opinion, one of the things that most of the time we forget, but is super important when it comes to high-level athletes is the ecology of the equipment. So the markers should be gathered in a competitive situation or similar environment without bothering the athletes at all. That is super important, because otherwise we're going to alter the measurements, and if we alter the measurements, our data is not going to be reliable, it's not going to be valid, and of course it doesn't matter if it's sensible or specific, because we cannot use it to make decisions. So the solutions chosen should include these characteristics are the ones that we are looking for. Ease of use and intuitive design, fast and efficient reporting of results. That is something, again, super relevant if we want to inform the coaches and the athletes on a day-to-day basis. The ability to translate data to players and coaches in a comprehensive way, specifically if they do not have a member of the staff that is the one that deals with the monitoring processes, and is something that when it comes to high-performance sports, we are going to find this specific member of the staff, but not when we are talking about the semi-elite levels. So most of the time they need technology that someone that is not an expert can use and interpret. So that's the reason why a lot of these companies are putting a lot of effort in creating really good softwares that can give us a lot of clues at the end of the day. Of course, capability of providing individual and group outcomes. That is something super important, and I'm going to tell you about that when I'm into the section of my specific research project at UAB, because the recovery profiles, general recovery profiles of the team and the individual ones at some points are really different. So that's something that we have to take into account. Of course, again, to identify meaningful changes is something super relevant, and our changes in sports sometimes can be really small. And the flexibility and adaptability to different disciplines, levels, and age groups, because in the end, most of the time, we have to invest a lot of money in buying equipment. If we can only use this equipment with one particular discipline, we need to invest the next time we need to implement these monitor processes in a different sport. So that's the reason why we're trying to find technology that can be useful in different sports. In some cases that is not possible because the characteristics are really different, but if we can use our money wisely, it's something that our institutions and the research grants are going to, in some ways, appreciate. When it comes to the second aspect, current limitations on the matter, so we have covered in some ways the state of the art, but right now we have to face which ones are the current limitations on the topic of injury prevention. And unfortunately, we have a lot of them. So let's try to go more in depth about these things. So if we want to take the right approach and we don't want to face this wall that we have in here, we have to take into account two really relevant aspects. First, the nature of load monitoring, and then the important constraints that we can find specifically when we are talking about team sports. Some of these constraints, and we are going to mention some of them really briefly. So as we've mentioned before, fatigue is something super complex. So the emergence of fatigue is multifactorial in nature. So it is complex to quantify its extent. So that's the reason why even in some cases like this proposal from Edwards and colleagues, they're trying to make a difference in between the perceived fatigue and the performance fatigue. And that is something super relevant because most of the time it's not the same, the perception of fatigue that I have than the real fatigue that I'm experiencing. And that's one of the advances that some researchers are working on. So here, for example, when it comes to perceived fatigue, some of them are going to be related to the maintenance of the homeostasis. Some of them are going to be related to the psychological aspect of this perception of fatigue. And then, of course, when it comes to performance fatigue, we're going to go more onto the physiology field, and we're going to find some aspects related to the contractile function and the muscle activation. So these aspects are going to be something that in the end can be measured more objectively if we have the right equipment and we can use the specific markers for it. And that, of course, is one of the limitations. This deficit is even more important in team sports because in team sports we have really big differences to individual sports with the fact that we have different layers of complexity. Here we're going to have the layer athlete, but at the same time we're going to have the layer game. At the same time we're going to have the layer sport. In some cases we're going to go to the physiology that is probably a layer that is under the player. So all these different layers of complexity are going to create different relationships, and that can be really a big difficulty when it comes to measure and to monitor loads, because there are different solutions right now at different levels of complexity. So you can find some metrics that are monitoring the game, some metrics that are monitoring the team, some metrics that are monitoring the athlete, and it is difficult to observe all of them and to make decisions based on all of them. So in most of the cases we have to choose in which layer of complexity we're going to focus, because otherwise we can have a lot of data, and again, sometimes having a lot of data can be even worse than not to have any data at all. That is what in some cases is called paralysis by analysis. The fact that if we have a lot of data, we can get even less insight than if we do not have any data at all and we use our intuition, especially when it comes to expert coaches. Then of course we have another problem, that is that we have different roles, different backgrounds, and different participation. It's not going to be the same one for and I'm going to come to volleyball because it's one of the sports that I know pretty well. It's not the same, the fatigue that a middle blocker or middle hitter is going to experience. It's not the same, the right side. It's not going to be the right side if it's a male or a female team, because their performance is really different. It's not going to be the same for the fifth year that is playing a lot than for the first year, that rookie that is not participating at all in our competitions this year because has to gain expertise. Do you understand me? So in the end, a lot of these things should be taken into account when monitoring these workloads, because we're going to find different profiles, taking into account all that. Of course, another of the problems that we're going to find really commonly in team sports is that we have schedules that are pretty difficult to deal with congested fixtures and a really long competitive season. And most of the time, the coaches are going to make decisions based on the microcycle, because they consider that the most important competition is the one coming next, and they cannot be sure about qualifying for nationals or for the playoff unless they win this week. So most of the time they are going to make the decisions thinking in the short term, only thinking in the short term. And that is something that when we have to implement some strategies for recovery and to think about the athletes in the long term, it's not that easy, because there's no job security when it comes to professional coaches, so they do not think much about the midterm or the long term. And that is difficult to deal with when you're a member of the staff that has the attribution of thinking about the midterm, long term of the athletes. Do you understand me? And when it comes to the coaches, and probably related to what we've been talking about, there's a tendency of skilled coaches to use intuition when periodizing loads and to overreact when losing. And everybody knows right now that there's a metric that is pretty famous when we are monitoring workloads, that is the acute chronic workload ratio. And we already know that there are some spikes in the acute chronic workload ratio that weeks after can create a lot of injuries. But at the same time, we know that many coaches, when they lose, they overreact and they implement really big loads on their athletes because they want to correct the problem that they had on the weekend. So to be a member of the staff, to be able to translate the information that we get from these monitoring load processes, and at the same time to be able to convince the coaches about the better practices is something super relevant, because most of the time they tend not to be so disciplined when they are periodizing, and in some cases, depending on their character, obviously, but they tend to overreact when they lose an important competition. So these difficulties, of course, are particular to the field of team sports. More limitations, and if you remember, we were talking about no single marker being the definitive one when we are talking about monitoring loads in sport. Really few markers have strong evidence backing their use, because we know that in sports theories, sample sizes tend to be really small, normally under 30 individuals. Now we are having a lot of trouble when it comes to applied research to publish, because many of the journals with these small sample sizes do not want our manuscripts. And for me, that's an error, because, for example, if you're working with a volleyball team, you're going to have maximum of 15 athletes, so you're never going to be able to reach that number. But at the same time, we have the high standard athletes. So if we cannot publish with small sizes, we're going to be forced not to use the real athletes. So the real object of our research is not going to be included in our studies. So for me, that's one of the dangers that we are facing right now with the standards of scientific publications. Of course, if we are working with athletes, with professional athletes or high-level athletes or high-standard athletes, there is always an absence of group controls. And sometimes you cannot even manipulate the variables, because no coach is going to let you implement something in half of the team and not implementing that measure with the rest of the team, because they want the benefit for all of them. So you have to implement the measure with the whole group. So it's really difficult to establish a control group. And that is one, again, of the limitations of the sport studies that are trying to find these markers. It is also difficult to make observations in competition where we have the maximal ecological validity. Do you remember the ecology? That was one of the important aspects. And if we are trying to simulate, simulations can lack motivation to perform at the maximal level. And that is something that, in my experience as a strength and conditioning coach for professional teams, is something that I have observed. Sometimes they want to compete and they compete at 100%, but sometimes some particular athletes do not want to compete during training, specifically the ones that are more, and I would say, experts, because they know they have to reserve themselves to the competition. So they tend to be really wise when it comes to their body, but at the same time they are in some ways impairing our processes. Most of the time, if we want to be 100% sure that our athletes are performing at a maximum, we have to conduct taper or similar strategies. So for sure, we cannot do that before an observation. So that's, again, another of the limitations. And for me, one of the biggest limitations that we are facing right now is that elite and professional sports are protecting their data. So even some players' associations are limiting its use. So when it comes to try to get some information from the processes that they're doing, it is something completely impossible. And in the end, research has to be conducted with low standard profile participants that are not the ones that are more relevant to the things we are observing. And I'm going to show you something from MBA. So let me go out. I'm pretty sure some people know about the agreements that the Players Association and the NBA as an organization reach. And as you can see here, there's an article in the last collective bargaining agreement, the one from 2017, that specifically deals with monitoring technology. And it says textually that they want to create a joint advisory committee to review and approve wearable devices for use by players. So the Players Association is going to be involved in deciding what are the monitoring processes that can be conducted in the NBA. Let's go to another paragraph. Teams may continue to request that on a voluntary basis, players use the following devices. So only these devices in here are approved. So you cannot implement a new one because it has not been passed by the Players Association. And a team may request a player to use in practice or otherwise not in a game. So for sure, during the situation that has the most ecological validity, we cannot use the same technology, and one is the problems in the NBA. They are using one technology for practices and a different technology for games because they cannot use these wearable devices during competition. But a player also may decline to use or discontinue use a wearable at any time. So we are in the middle of a process gathering data, and one of our athletes can tell us that he doesn't want to wear the wearable anymore. So in the end, we're going to have problems when it comes to the continuity of the process. Of course, we have to give him an explanation, what the device is going to measure, what such measurement means, the benefits to the player in obtaining such data, and some things that are more interesting. Can be used only for limited purposes, players' health and performance purposes, and team on-court tactical and strategic purposes only. They cannot be used in negotiations. So in the end, if we know something about our athlete, health cannot be used during negotiations of contracts. And if we do that, so imagine that an NBA franchise decides to implement one of these processes, a fine of up to $200,000 on any team shown to have violated this provision. So in the end, that is limiting a lot our possibilities of conducting research with high-performance athletes. And again, if we do not have this sample, our research is not going to be so valuable. And that is something that is right now at the NBA level, but for sure is going to be at every professional franchise level. And we are not going to get more data from high-standard professional athletes because of these reasons that you see here and because of the collective agreements. When it comes to methodologies and metrics used in scientific research to monitor loads, that are the ones that I showed you on a really big table from a consensus on monitoring workloads, I have selected the ones that are considered internal loads that can be useful in team sports and the internal loads as well. So you can see here in this table, for example, for the power output or time motion analysis or neuromuscular function, the scientific evidence that it has behind. But then here you have an arrow pointing at the utility, the use in team sports, and the limitations, the cost, the equipment, the processing, the ecology, the construct validity in some of the cases. When it comes to internal loads, we have the same here with the scientific evidence, the use in team sports, and the limitations. And in some cases, for example, with biochemical, hormonal, immunological markers, we have that the scientific evidence is conflictive, but it has been used in the past in some cases. But at the same time, the possibility of using it in team sports, as an example, is really low because it's time-consuming, it's not practical, and of course, it has a really big cost. So that is one of the things that we have to take into account when deciding what measurements to use. It's been adapted again from a really good article on the matter from Shona Halson, published in 2014. And this is a summary of the measurements that she is proposing on the paper that I think can be more useful in team sports, or at the same time has been tested in team sports, but it right now gives us a lot of problems when we want to implement it with athletes, and specifically when we are talking about teams that have a lot of athletes, like is the case of rugby or professional soccer or American football. The idea right now, or more or less the way to face these limitations, or the approach that we are taking, is to try to find a combination of objective and subjective measurements that can provide a balance between the athlete perception and what we consider objective and quantifiable in practice. So you have a really recent proposal from Baron Terhem and colleagues in soccer specifically. They are dealing with the fitness fatigue processes over the athlete, and they are dividing the load into physiological and biomechanical, and in the end they do different observations taking into account the external and internal loads here. And for example here, when it comes to internal load of the physiological aspects, they are measuring kinetic energy, metabolic power, the internal load, the oxygen uptake, cardiovascular demand or perceived effort. When it comes to the external load and the biomechanical aspects, the measure is the whole body loads with ground reaction forces, accelerations and decelerations, the rate of acceleration, joint load, muscle load, and perceived tissue damage and perceived effort when it comes to internal load. And here they are classifying failure, overload, and homeostasis, the different adaptations that the athlete can face when it comes to these different aspects. There's another one here from Coyne and colleagues. In this publication, Aaron Coates from Australia is involved. He's considered one of the worldwide experts when it comes to the use of RPE, for example, in fatigue. And they are doing an interesting proposal because they make a difference in between open and closed sports, considering open the ones that we have to make a lot of decisions. So team sports are going to be in this group. And they give us potential measures I'm making a distinction in between the ones that are going to assess the acute loads and the ones that are going to make observations over chronic loads. So here, they're going to use acute observations. Some of them are going to be subjective and some of them are going to be objective, and it's the same for the chronic measurements. Some of them are going to be subjective, some of them are going to be objective. So for example, here, they're using POMS or ARSS, so subjective wellness and MSK screen. For the acute objective heart rate variability, DC potential jump analysis, MSK screen. And for the chronic subjective, they're using the session RP, differential RP, the TRIM, and as objective, they consider the accelerometer or GPS, the TRIM, and the heart rate TRIM. So here we have a proposal based on scientific research that I think can be useful when making decisions on which of these markers use. And again, we need a lot of research because we have a lot of possibilities, so to be on track is something super relevant, not to lose any time. And time is really valuable. Time is money, as you know. More limitations. Many coaches right now have heard about monitoring training loads, so most of them have I wouldn't say the need, but they have the interest to monitor these loads. But when it comes to programs at semi-elite levels, the cost of technology is something really big. But once we manage to get the technology, we have another problem that we have to pay in most of this technology on a year-to-year basis to get access to the data, because right now all the platforms are paid, and it's one of the problems that we are facing. Of course, the companies are generating a lot of revenues based on that, but I can have a lot of technology. If I not pay for the access to the platform, it's going to be useless for me, and that is something that in my situation that I'm the director of a really small research unit is something that we have to think about twice before deciding to purchase one technology or the other. Of course, in some of the cases, they have to hire specialized staff or assume the man hours required to process and understand the data, and they cannot afford to get one specialized member of the staff to do specifically, to deal specifically with these aspects. So this is going to be another of the limitations that we're going to face. I wouldn't say probably at the highest competition level, but probably when we are talking about semi-elite levels and when we talk about varsity teams, for example, here in Canada, I know this is one of the problems they are facing right now. Another of the limitations is that when it comes, for example, to try to prevent injuries, that is one of the really big topics here at the CPRC, so I know that something relevant here at the University of Calgary. The problem is that to use load monitoring to minimize or to try to minimize, and I'm saying minimize, not preventing, because in the end, everybody knows here that to prevent all the injuries is something impossible. When we try to minimize these injuries is really controversial to use metrics that right now are becoming really famous and that we will talk about them later on. Because injuries happen under complex mechanisms and a multitude of factors may influence their risk, I do really like this graph here from Baranholm, because in some ways shows us that we only, by having some internal factors, we are not going to sustain an injury. We are going to have a predisposed athlete, but we need some exposure to external risk factors, and then we're going to have a susceptible athlete. But at the same time, we need an inciting event, otherwise we are not going to have the injury. So sometimes we assess a lot of internal risk factors, and we find athletes that do have these internal risk factors, that they're really apparent, but never get an injury. And that's because we need to fulfill all the stages. So in the end, even if with load monitoring, we can determine that someone is exposed to external risk factors, maybe they are not going to get injured because they are not showing the internal risk factors, or the inciting event is not going to come. That's the reason why screening, when it comes to injury prevention, is so conflictive, because it's not like when we are screening cancer, going back to Roald Barr and a nice talk that he gave 2 years ago in one of the IOC injury prevention conferences, because most of the time we can find some of these internal factors, but the screening is not going to be positive because the injury is not going to come never after that. You understand? It's not the same as if we have a tumor where the possibilities of developing a cancer are almost 100%. So that's one of the problems that we have when we use load monitoring to try to minimize injuries. Although that, low injury rates obviously are significantly associated with competitive success in many sports. So that is something that I'm not discouraging the people here about doing. So I'm not saying we do not have to use load monitoring to try to minimize injuries, because we have to keep doing that. But at the same time, we have to acknowledge that the studies assessing injury risk are often distant retrospective studies, and they are performed again on semi-elite populations. And the amount of preparation that a high-performance athlete has is not the same as a semi-elite player has. It's not the same the amount of training that we have with varsity teams here, for example, with students that are student athletes, that the amount of preparation that we have with high-performance athletes, that they can devote 100% of their time just to practice. So a lot of countermeasures can be used in these professional athletes that cannot be used with semi-elite athletes because of time constraints. Most of the studies are going to use metrics showing association with injury, but these same metrics are poor predictors of injury. So association and prediction is not the same, and we have to be really clear about that, because otherwise we're going to make mistakes interpreting the data that comes from these studies. Up until now, we have another really big problem, that is that we don't have unique solution to categorize injuries. So in many studies, we're going to find different criteria, time loss, medical attention, physio attention, when it comes to what's an injury. So that is going to always make it really difficult to compare results, because the way to categorize injury and the attention that the athlete is receiving is something really different. And it's something that is conflicted, because at the same time, a lot of studies right now are using match loss. But why match loss is more valuable than time loss or than medical attention, or at some point, even in some ways, we are like making our athletes reframe to go to see the doctors. So do you understand? So this categorization is something really relevant, not only to conduct research, but at the same time, the way we are assessing injuries. Of course, studies assessing injury risks need really big samples or multi-center approaches to be conclusive in their results. That's probably one of the reasons I'm here, because I'm here also to say, hello, we are from Spain, we do a lot of research, we want to do research with you, because otherwise we are going to make conclusions that are not really good, because we're going to use small size samples. And one of the most relevant things, and I don't want no one to be offended with that, but mental factors have received really little attention so far, and we understand that in some athletes these are really relevant. In my personal experience, for example, with female athletes, this is something super relevant, and we do not pay much attention to these aspects when it comes to assessing injury rates and to try to find solutions to minimize injuries, because in some cases the mental factors are going to play a really big role to sustain an injury or not to sustain it at all. And because lately, as you know, with really famous metrics, and you can see that term in there, to assess injury risk, and obviously we are talking about the acute chronic workload ratio. That is right now one of the tools that almost every educated coach is using, and I think is a good resource, but it shouldn't be the only one that we have to use in the future. We know that we're having some problems. It is different depending on if we calculate rolling averages versus exponentially weighted moving averages. So the two ways of calculating the load are pretty different. There has been some criticism lately because the use of coupled versus uncoupled acute chronic workload ratio calculations can change the outcome of the ratio. The numerator and denominator in the acute chronic workload ratio, as everybody can understand, is mathematically coupled when the acute load is included in the calculation of the chronic load. So someone is saying that therefore is spuriously correlated, and that obviously is something that we have to take into account when we are relying in one particular metric so much. But at the same time, we also know, and that is in some ways the answer of the author, the father of the acute chronic workload ratio, in one of his latest publications in the British Journal of Sport Medicine. The research using the exponentially weighted moving averages model is still scarce, and the studies comparing coupled versus uncoupled methods need to be conducted. That is something that is going to come in the future, so I'm pretty sure that right now, somewhere in the world, someone is using different metrics, so we will know in really soon, in the near future, what is going on when it comes to calculate ACWR in one way or the other one. But that is something, again, that we have to take into account when using these metrics to calculate loads and to make decisions based on these calculations. So the first section was the state of the art, more or less. I hope I managed to give some insight about what's going on when it comes to load monitoring. The second one was in some ways a review of the limitations that we've been facing. So based on all that, I decided at some point that I wanted to come back to Canada to conduct a research project in the University of Alberta. Why there? It's something pretty simple. I came back in 2013 to Canada to have my first experience abroad as a researcher, and it was at the University of Alberta. Since then, I had really good relationship with the people from the UAB, and I have a family, 2 kids and a wife, and we wanted to have an experience abroad for a while. So everything was kind of aligned to do this research project because the possibility to work with them was open. At the same time, they were hosting nationals for the women's volleyball team. So it was something pretty interesting that, again, it aligned all the planets to me to come here. So in the end, my initial thoughts when trying to implement this research study was that it is really difficult to find studies that have developed a methodology to monitor workloads in volleyball. You have some really good examples here in Canada with some interesting people doing research on the matter, but you cannot find a lot of research as you can find in soccer, for example, or in rugby or in Australian football, because we know the Australians have been the pioneers in this topic. So I wanted to come to a country where volleyball is really important. In my country, it's not the same. Specifically, when it comes to volleyball, we consider it a minor sport, so the opportunities to do research with high-level athletes are really reduced. And because you have one unique thing within your system in North America, that is that the high-level sport, in most of the cases, is strongly related to the universities. So when you offer the possibility to conduct a research study, it's something that is perceived positively. It's not the same in my country because sport in my country is club-based. So when you knock on the door, you're going to be in trouble because they feel that you want something from them. It's not the same in here. So at every moment during my stay at the University of Alberta, I was feeling that I was a taker, but at the same time I was a giver. Do you understand me? So everybody was benefiting from the situation, and that is something that is, again, really difficult to find a place where the atmosphere can be the same one. So that's, again, the reason why we came to implement the project. So many questions remain still unanswered because really few studies monitoring workloads in volleyball. So we wanted a project that can make can answer in some ways these questions, and at the same time that the project was feasible and helped us to understand how this data can improve our decision-making processes, and especially for the coaches and the athletes. So they should get a benefit from participating in the project. So in the end, we designed this project that was called Relationship Between Readiness Indicators, Training Loads and Fatigue Induced by Training and Competition in Collegiate Female Volleyball Athletes. And the two main aims were to determine the relationship between fatigue induced by volleyball and different readiness, wellness, and load metrics, and at the same time to try to establish a methodology to monitor workloads in volleyball. So I would say that the conclusions from the study are going to be interesting, but for me, the most interesting thing that is going to come from this project is that in the end, we're going to have a real methodology to monitor loads in volleyball that everybody can use. I'm in contact with some other people doing research using more or less the same procedures, and with companies that are providers for the solutions that we use. And they tell me all the time that many coaches have the technology but do not know how to use it. So in the end, to establish the methodology is something that can be really useful. Of course, this is only a humble contribution. We have to keep working on that, but at the same time, it can be, we thought that it can be a starting point, a good starting point. The research team is the one that you see in here, so many people involved. It was difficult to fulfill the requirements of 2 different ethics board committees because I had to get the approval from my local institution and at the same time the one from the UAB, so a lot of paperwork, but in the end we managed to implement the project. And I would like to say that the origin of the idea that I had to come here, I always say that the project was not an excuse, but it was a way to come back to Canada, and I want to be 100% honest about that. And at some point I had the idea of how to design the methodology, and it came because I read this paper that is from Spanish researchers. It's published in the Journal of Sport Sciences. It's jump height loss as an indicator of fatigue during sprint training. And the thing is that they use counter movement jump height for monitoring sprint training and quantifying the mechanical and metabolic fatigue, because they found that there is high relationships observed between counter movement height loss and counter movement jump height loss and the metabolic response. So the accumulation of lactate and ammonia was one of the limiting factors. So it's a physiological response. But in the end, my question was, can this loss in jump height also have a mental and neuromuscular origin? Because the amount of lactate and ammonia that our volleyball athletes are going to have in their bodies is not significant enough to justify the jump height loss. But if we have another explanation to this loss in height, and this one is mental and neuromuscular, maybe we are finding a really useful, reliable, valid, and really ecological tool that we can use to try to monitor fatigue in volleyball athletes. And that was the original question. So the hypotheses were, is fatigue expressed as percentage of jump loss, and here you have the formula, or readiness of the athlete expressed as percentage of jump loss, taking only into account, in this case, the jumps that we were doing previously to the practices and competition. In this case, we made the difference in between the ones before the practice or competition and the ones after. Okay, so 2 different metrics here that we can establish. Are these measures of fatigue and readiness associated with all these factors in here? And is there any other association among factors? These were my initial thoughts. So that is something that we have been trying to prove. So we measured the HRV, wellness indicators, HRV before the practice. This one's in the morning, this was before the practice. This was in the morning after, to see the recovery profiles. The RPE of the athletes, the number of jumps that they used, performed during practices or competitions, then different ratios. Because for me, it's not the same the number of jumps isolated than the number of jumps per minute. That is something that can change the profile of performance of the athlete, even if we establish a ratio. Then the session RPE, the acute chronic workload ratio, with different ways of calculating it, always using 1:7, because we thought that this is the measure that can be more useful for us, because it gives more insight to change things, taking into account that we are talking about team sports and microcycles are really relevant in team sports. So the 1:7 is a good measure, and some other people that I have consulted on the matter agree with that. If there was a different behavior in the fatigue of the athletes depending on if they were practicing or competing, if the game outcome or the injuries, in this case medical and physio attention, were some things that we should take into account. So these were the initial hypotheses. I always say that I set up this project more to disprove things than to prove things. Because most of the time you read a lot, you listen a lot of things, you pay attention to the topic, and you see many things that from a coach perspective do not make sense, in my humble opinion. So I express obviously my respect for the people doing this research. I read it, I cite it if I need to, but sometimes I don't feel they're really applied. And that is something, again, that in my personal perception is super relevant, because you cannot go to the coach and tell them a story. You have to tell them something that they can believe straightforward and they can apply right now. Otherwise, you're going to fail, in my personal experience. So in the end, we recruited 6 experienced female collegiate athletes with at least 3 years of regular volleyball practice and able to participate in training and competition without any limitations. As we were going to assess champs, liberos were excluded because their performance has not much to do with jumping ability. They do not jump much during training or competition. And the thing is that the procedures made them underwent readiness and fatigue tests daily during an 8-week period. And it was a relevant 8-week period because it went from mid-January to mid-April, where they were having the nationals, and we were 100% sure that we will going to be at the national championship because we were hosting it. So that was one of the advantages. So we were 100% sure that the period was going to be 8 weeks. So training and competition loads were also monitored during the same period to establish these associations. And the challenges that we were facing, we wanted the study not to be invasive, to use pertinent measurements, procedures that can be easily understood after few information sessions, because the athletes received information prior to my arrival here, but at the same time I was pretty sure that they would need to have a couple of information sessions that were instructed by myself, because I was the person knowing more about the research project. We wanted the information to be meaningful and useful, not time-consuming at all. These kids study. They're really smart. They study a lot. They have labs. They have classes. They have to come to practices. They have to compete. So we cannot establish a process that is time-consuming for them. A project that should not disturb the athletes during their daily schedules. And again, that was something really relevant. And data collection by only one person, because we didn't want to involve many people in the staff within the project, because they have some other duties to fulfill. Although I have to say, and that's the reason why we have the asterisks here, that some people in the research team had to do some of the measurements when we were playing the away games, because I didn't go to all the away games with the team. So in some cases, some of the members of the staff were doing or fulfilling these duties, and that's the reason why we wanted the process to be something that can be easily implemented. So the testing, essentially what we did in the morning, the athletes, just after waking up, took their heart rate variability. We will talk about the equipment afterwards, and they collected additional information about the hours, the quality of the sleep, their level of soreness, and the energy levels, specifically in the morning. Then before coming to the practices that normally were in the afternoon, only during 1 week they were different because we were a reading week, so we altered the dynamics, but it was the only exception. They took their heart rate variability again with 3 maximal counter movement jumps before the practice and after a standardized warm-up. That was always the same one for all the athletes, because we wanted to ensure that they were in the right condition to do maximal counter movement jumps. Then we gathered the number of jumps performed during practice and the minutes of practice during their training or competition. And then in the end, they performed 3 maximal counter movement jumps with the rate of perceived exertion on a scale 0 to 10. At some point, we read that probably to use 0 to 100 is more sensitive, but I think with 0 to 10, it was pretty clear for them. And these were the measurements that we did post-training and competition. Post-training and competition, with the 3 maximal counter movement jumps, after practice there is no problem. After competition, it's not that easy to have access to the athletes, because imagine that we have lost a really important match, that they have to say hello to the family that is coming to say hello to them or whatever. And I have to say that in our case, our athletes were super disciplined, and I have to be really grateful to them, because even the day we lost the semi-final of the national championships, they were doing these jumps for me. So it's something that I really appreciate. And again, it's not that easy to do that with professional athletes. And if we do not find people that is really committed, we are at risk of fake data, and we don't want that in our conclusions. And the calendar is the one that I told you here. So we started the project. You have here, well, the RPE measurements, information to participants, PARQ and informed consent, the initial anthropometric measurements, and then the testing. You have all the process that it went, specifically from the 16th, where I gave my initial information session to the team, until the 15th, because we didn't monitor the game on the 16th. It was the bronze medal match, and I decided that it was not worthy doing, because depending on the outcome, it was the last game. 1 day of data is not going to change anything, and at the same time, we were giving the athletes the freedom of not to be pending on the jumps after the competition, that they've been doing that for 8 weeks, so I thought it was something good for them. The equipment. We used equipment that has been validated by research, and you have here the references for all the pieces of equipment that we've used. So we use the Elite HRV app that has been validated in the past, and at the same time we had the opportunity to use it in Android devices and iOS devices. That's something that we appreciate, because before coming we were not 100% sure of the phones that the athletes were going to have, and they should use their own phone. So that was something relevant, to have the application that can be used in both OSs. We used the Polar H7 heart rate bands. I brought them from Spain myself, and they have been validated. Specifically, the H7 has been validated in this study in 2017. So it is a good piece of equipment to measure heart rate and heart rate variability. That was a variable that was interesting for us. And then we use the inertial movement units from BIRD and the BIRD Coach app that have been validated in these studies. In some of them, participation from people from the CPRC. And with 6 units, this is a device that is pretty interesting for volleyball, because it captures the amount of jumps. It's really small. It doesn't bother the athletes at all. It can be worn next to the navel. That is specifically the requirements that where the validation studies have been performed, and we had no troubles with that. The technology works normally pretty well. At some point, some of the units get stuck, or some of them get run out of battery, but we were ready for that because we had some extra units, and I was paying attention all the time to the data during practices, so just in case we had to reset one unit, we did it instantly, so no missing data when it comes to that. And this is more or less the idea of the study, and I'm going to end really soon. I'm sorry for the delay. The thing is that right now we have preliminary results because we are analyzing the data right now. So what we have observed so far is that the HRV pre-practice competition had a higher average value than the morning HRV. So in the end, if we have to decide what measurement to take, probably the one that is more useful is the one pre-practice, because the athletes are in some ways predisposed to train in the afternoon, so their bodies have performed some adaptations to train. So they have a better level of activation, not only when it comes to HRV, also when it comes to root mean square, but obviously it's the way that HRV is calculated by using the algorithms in the application. We used a binary logistic stepwise regression model to try to find factors that are associated, and remember, this is association. There is no prediction here, there's only association. When it comes to a 10% jump loss, that is the value that we have used because it's the one that the original paper is using, 10% value. So we consider that an athlete has been significantly affected by fatigue when there's a loss of 10% or more. two factors that are associated with this 10% loss when we assess the general pool of data: soreness and the number of jumps in the practice. So if they jump more, they're going to be more fatigued. But if they have more soreness in the morning, they are going to have more fatigue after the practice in the evening. And that is something super relevant too. Two factors were associated, again, significantly in a binary logistics stepwise model to low jump readiness, because we calculated the readiness with a 10% loss, taking into account a baseline of all the jumps before practice. Do you understand the idea? So differently from the fatigue that has been assessed by difference in between before and after. The week and the fact that it was a practice or competition, so our athletes were not the same ready if we were before a practice or a competition and depending on the week. And that is something pretty normal because there's a periodization taking into account the weeks. So especially the weeks before nationals, and with us not competing for the Canada West tournament, we increased the load because we wanted them to be ready. And that's the reason why in some cases they were more fatigued. But again, this is a group analysis, and then you have to go individual per individual, but as you can understand, I'm not going to disclose the individual analysis. And then something really interesting. We calculated the acute chronic workload ratio with session RPE per minute, but at the same time creating arbitrary units coming from number of jump per minutes. That is a different way of calculating it. In my opinion, one is more subjective, the other one is more objective, because the data are coming from the inertial units. And what we have to say, in our case, using the 1:7 ratio, they had really good agreement, but it's not perfect. 0.83. And if you know about correlations, it's far from being perfect. So in the end, two informations, one famous metric, but it's not the same to use it one way or the other, or to use one way of calculating arbitrary units or the other one. And that is something that we have to take into account. But if I have to establish a methodology for the next season, right now I cannot tell you which one is better. So it depends probably on the decisions that we make to use, because obviously if you use the RPE per minutes, then you cannot include in your assessments the RPE, because those values are going to be collinear. Do you understand the idea? So probably in my case, I could use the RPE and I could use the number of jumps per minute, because that way I can have two metrics at the same time. But it's something that you need to know about, because otherwise you're in danger of making wrong assumptions. Okay. So considerations and future perspectives, although we have not concluded the analysis. Of course, individual player analysis should be carried out, because some of the players we know right now had different recovery profiles and factors associated with their monitor fatigue. As you know, we wanted to provide insight to the athletes, and we've been doing that. So we've been doing individual analysis because they had to get something in return for participating in the project, not only for the sake of science. Data from practices and games should be analyzed separately. It's something that is one of the analyses we're going to conduct, because we think we can find different associations in here. In several of the variables analyzed, there is multicollinearity. So previous tests should be performed, but once the variables are detected, it will be the practitioner's decision to choose the variables for the analysis, because you cannot include RPE per minute and RPE at the same time in the analysis, because these variables are collinear. Monitor fatigue through service attack velocity loss is one of the possibilities we're thinking about with the use of radar terminology. I conducted my PhD on the use of radar related to statistics, so that is one of the possibilities. To add some other variables to the fatigue profile, to calculate fatigue thresholds using small worthwhile changes, because in the end, we have assessed fatigue with a 10% threshold and fatigue with a 5% threshold, and the number of cases is really different. So more than 5 maybe is more than the individual variability, and we are talking about athletes that jump a lot. So maybe 10% is not the right value to assess fatigue in volleyball. Do you understand? Maybe for one of our athletes, more than 7% is going to be a big level of fatigue. And we are using 10% because it's what is validated. But the difference in between more than 5% and more than 10% is really big in here. And again, we have athletes that jump a lot, and they are really ready when it comes to jump. So maybe their fatigue should be assessed with a lower threshold. And that is one of the questions that we have. And then, sorry about that, jumps versus plus 15 jumps. That is something that is super relevant. Because in the end, in our study, we conducted the number of jumps. That was the initial idea. And you can see one of the practices at random. You don't see any names in here, so there's no problem with that. look at this athlete in here, number 4, 283 jumps. But when we go to the ones that are plus 15 inches, only 43. So the profile is really different if we consider high intensity jumps than if we make the difference from the total number of jumps. But at the same time, the the total number of jumps is also important because they are doing that. And it's the way we, in some ways, classify fatigue in volleyball. But probably in the future, if we keep doing this methodology, we will pay attention to the plus 15s because they are the significant number of jumps, although not in all the players. Because you're going to find the setters that they are not going, and in this case, I can say this player was a setter. They have a low number of plus 15s, but they jump a lot. So they are fatiguing differently. So profiles are really different, and again, that's one of the limitations that we have in volleyball. I'm pretty aware that right now we are in Dinoland, but you can understand that I cannot feel but gratitude for the people participating in the study. And of course, I have to say this phrase that we always say at the University of Alberta, was a panda, always a panda. And that's the reason why I conducted the study again here. So I wanted, obviously, to express my gratitude publicly when coming here to deliver this talk to the people in the team, because I consider myself part of the staff and I feel a lot of appreciation for these guys over here. And we have some take-home messages, and I go really briefly on them. There is still a lot of questions unsolved regarding this aspect of load monitoring. Research and applied initiatives obviously are clearly needed, so we need more researchers going on this type of projects. One sole variable is not going to fully explain internal or external load. Sport characteristics and environment should be obviously considered. In my humble opinion, a qualified practitioner should process the data and translate the results to coaches and athletes, and not only someone that knows how to use the technology, someone that knows about the sport, because otherwise you're not going to be able to give meaningful information. Data from workload monitoring should not be used for selection purposes. That's something super important. Otherwise, the compliance rates diminish and chances of false data increase, and it's something that some studies have observed, especially in those players that are not sure that they are going to be part of the starting lineup. They refrain from giving the RPEs that are real because they don't want the coaches to use this information for selecting them or not, and that is something that we should be aware that there is a level of confidentiality that we are not stepping onto if we want our athletes to be completely honest with us. More effective data analysis and visualization solutions should be developed in the future. We are in the world of big data right now, so a lot of new technology is going to come to help us. And of course, a multifactorial approach considering athletes' readiness, informal variables like coaches' experience and athletes' understanding is something really relevant to make decisions. And it's something that at the end of the study, when we were giving information to the athletes on their individual assessments, it was probably one of the richest parts of the study, because it is really good to see what they think about their profiles at the same time you're giving them information and the way they feel. And with some athletes, their RPE is super adjusted to the real fatigue level they are experiencing. So in the end, that's something that we should consider, because a really useful metric, really easily gathered, and at the same time, in some athletes, it can be really adjusted to the reality of their fatigue. Okay, so these are the take-home messages. We will give some time for the discussion. I will be here all day long with the people from the CPRC team, but I just wanted to tell you about my center. We have a really small school in an area that is really close to Barcelona, 50 minutes up north, in the middle of a valley, really close to the Pyrenees. We are trying to do our best when it comes to research, and that's the reason why I go everywhere and I try to convey what we are doing right now. It's called the Sport and Physical Activity Study Center for the University of Vic, Central University of Catalonia, and currently carrying out projects about recovery, load monitoring, injury prevention in sports, sports technology, and sports analytics. Trying to find funding in my country for this type of research that is not easy, because obviously, you know, we're coming from a really big recession, and it is always easier to fund medicine-based research than to help us to do things in sports, but we are dealing with that matter. And about me, I'm the director of this unit that was created in 2015. I was the one stepping up to be the director, and since then I've been there. I'm also a member of the Sports Performance Analysis and Research Group at the same university, and my experience, I consider myself an applied researcher because I come from this practical route, and the things that I care the most about right now is athletes' health, sport performance analysis, and sports technology. You have here my contacts, just in case you want to stay in touch, my email address, my Twitter and Instagram accounts. 80% of the use I give to them is professional, 20% personal, sorry about that, and then my ResearchGate account. And I want to end with a quote. In all the training that we receive about how to do presentations, and I did my best, you have to think that I'm not using my first language, and it's always difficult. In fact, in my country and in my region, we speak 3 of them, so I do my best. I hope it wasn't that bad. But we are always told to end with a quote because it's something that the audience will remember. And I will use this one from Carl Sagan, passed away 2010. We live in a society exquisitely dependent on science and technology, in which hardly anyone knows anything about science and technology. And I think it's a good analogy of what's going on right now with monitoring training loads, because we have a lot of technology, a lot of data, a lot of information. But when it comes to use it wisely, I think there's a lot of gaps that we need to overcome in the future. And thank you for being here, and open to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pena, and that was a very excellent presentation. Thank you for spending so much time to explain to us about workload monitoring. And I'm sure we all learned 1 or 2 things. And one thing to remember, if I don't remember this, is that too much analysis leads to paralysis. I think I'll remember that. Sometimes we focus, we don't get too much outcomes, too much data might paralyze you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pena. If you want to have a private conversation with him, you can just stay back. I'm just going to close this meeting because we're running behind time. He's going to be here for another 10 minutes thereabouts, and please feel free to come forward for the free chat. Thank you, everyone. See you in 2 weeks' time.